Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I had spent 4 years pushing myself harder than I ever thought possible, sacrificing sleep, weekends, and even friendships just to make sure that when this day finally arrived, I could stand tall, knowing I had earned every single bit of it. The degree I held in my hands wasn't just paper, it was proof, solid and undeniable, that I had made it on my own, without anyone clearing the path for me, without shortcuts, without the kind of effortless praise that had been handed to my brother since the day he could form a full sentence. The party was packed, our backyard filled with relatives I hadn't seen in years, friends who had promised to stop by, and people who were probably just here for the food and free drinks. My mother had done her best to make everything look elegant, stringing lights across the fence, setting up a buffet table with trays of catered food, making sure everything looked like it belonged in one of those sentimental family photo albums she loved. But none of that mattered when my father finally stepped forward, clinking his glass, demanding attention, taking control of the moment like he always did. His voice was strong, steady, the kind of voice that had always filled the house with certainty, the kind of voice that had shaped the way people saw Nathan and me, even before we had the chance to define ourselves. "Let's all raise our glasses to my daughter, Sam," he said, his tone warm, practiced, but with just the slightest hint of something dismissive, something that told me the words coming next would not be the ones I deserved. "She's worked hard, and we're all proud of her, of course, but let's be honest." He paused, smiling, giving the audience time to react, to lean in, to let the weight of his words settle. "Nathan is the real genius in the family, and we all know it." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, wasn't cruel, but it was enough to send a sharp, hot wave of humiliation through me, enough to make my fingers tighten around the stem of my glass, enough to remind me that no matter what I did, no matter how far I went, I would always be standing in his shadow. Nathan smirked, leaning back in his chair, his confidence unshaken, his expression completely unsurprised because he had always expected this, had always known that he didn't have to prove anything to be seen as exceptional. I swallowed the bitter taste rising in my throat, willing myself not to react, not to let it show, not to give my father the satisfaction of knowing that he had just taken something important and made it feel small. But then, just as I was about to force a polite smile, just as I was about to let it roll off my back the way I had learned to do so many times before, I heard someone chuckle from the other end of the table, a sharp, amused sound that cut through the polite hum of conversation like a knife. "That's funny," said a voice, dry and unimpressed, carrying just enough weight to make the entire table turn toward the speaker. "Because Nathan just failed my class." The words landed like a bomb, the kind of statement that sucks the air out of the room, that leaves an uncomfortable silence in its wake, the kind that turns laughter into stunned, awkward stillness. My father's smirk vanished instantly, his face tightening, his grip on his glass stiffening as he turned toward the man who had spoken. Professor Anderson sat there, completely relaxed, stirring his drink idly, his expression unreadable but unmistakably entertained. Nathan's face drained of color, his lips parting slightly as if searching for words, searching for some way to undo what had just been said, but nothing came. The tension was immediate, heavy, spreading like wildfire as eyes darted between my father, my brother, and the man who had just single-handedly shattered the illusion my father had been selling for years. "You must be mistaken," my father said finally, his voice controlled but tight, his fingers tightening around his glass in a way that made his knuckles stand out starkly against his skin. Professor Anderson raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening just slightly, the kind of expression a person wore when they knew they held the upper hand. "No mistake," he said, taking a sip of his drink before placing the glass back down with a soft clink. "Nathan didn't just fail, he barely showed up, turned in half-finished assignments, and bombed the final. If he's the genius in the family, I'd hate to see what the rest of you look like." A nervous, uneasy laugh rippled through the guests, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others glancing at Nathan as if seeing him for the first time, as if realizing that maybe, just maybe, The golden boy wasn't quite as untouchable as they had been led to believe. Nathan let out a forced, breathy chuckle, shaking his head as he tried to gather himself, his hand waving dismissively as if he could push the entire conversation aside. "That's not exactly fair," he said quickly, his voice too light, too casual, his smile stretched too thin. "I mean, I had a lot going on this semester." "Sure," Professor Anderson said smoothly, interrupting him without hesitation, his tone laced with something that almost sounded like pity. "A lot of excuses." The impact of those words hit harder than anything else, harder than the initial revelation, harder than the laughter that had come at my expense just minutes ago. I watched as my father struggled to form a response, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching, his entire body stiff with the kind of humiliation he had never expected to experience in public. Certainly not at a party that was supposed to be a celebration of his child's success. But for once, the success wasn't Nathan's. And for once, the failure was. The irony of it all was almost too much, a slow, creeping satisfaction curling in my stomach as I watched the reality settle in, as I watched the perfect, unshakable image of my brother begin to crack. Nathan turned to me then, his eyes flicking toward mine, searching for something, maybe for help, maybe for reassurance, maybe for an escape from the hole he had just fallen into. But I just smiled, my grip on my glass loosening as I let out a slow, steady breath. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to say a single word. The truth had already done all the work for me. The tension from the party still clung to the air like a thick fog, lingering long after the guests had left, long after the last forced smile had faded, long after the plates had been cleared and the lights had been turned off. My father had spent the rest of the evening pretending that nothing had happened, pretending that Nathan's failure had been some sort of misunderstanding, pretending that the man who had publicly humiliated his golden boy had simply been mistaken. But I had seen the way his fingers had clenched around his glass, the way his jaw had tightened, the way his eyes had flicked toward Nathan with something dangerously close to doubt. Nathan had retreated quickly after the party ended, claiming exhaustion, claiming he just didn't want to deal with the drama, claiming that everyone was blowing things out of proportion, that people fail classes all the time and it wasn't a big deal. He had brushed past me in the hallway, his shoulder knocking into mine, his face carefully blank but his eyes burning with something ugly, something unsettled, something that told me he wasn't just embarrassed, he was afraid. And that, more than anything, made me stop and think. Because for as long as I had known him, Nathan had never been afraid of anything, had never been worried about consequences, had never once hesitated when it came to living inside the carefully crafted illusion that my father had built for him. I sat on the edge of my bed, scrolling through my phone, my fingers tapping absently against the screen as I went through post after post from my own graduation, seeing the flood of congratulations, the pictures of me in my cap and gown, the comments from professors, classmates, distant relatives who had never once called but somehow felt compelled to acknowledge my success now. And then, almost without thinking, I pulled up Nathan's profile, expecting to see something similar, expecting to see at least one picture, at least one post about his own graduation. But there was nothing. No cap and gown photos. No celebratory posts. No family pictures of my parents beaming with pride at their firstborn son. Just silence. A cold weight settled in my stomach, something sharp and uneasy curling around my ribs, something that felt a lot like realization. Nathan had never mentioned graduation, not once, not in passing, not in any of the smug, self-important conversations he always managed to steer back toward himself. He had never talked about final exams, never talked about job prospects, never given any indication that he was finishing his degree at all. I had been so used to his arrogance, so used to my father's unwavering belief in his brilliance, that I had never even considered the possibility that there was nothing to believe in at all. I clicked through his tagged photos, searching for anything, some proof that he had actually been where he said he was, that he had actually been doing what he was supposed to be doing. But every picture told the same story: Nathan at parties, Nathan at the beach, Nathan with friends at concerts, Nathan everywhere except a classroom. I stood abruptly, the the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, my breath coming just a little too fast, my heart pounding just a little too hard. This wasn't just about one failed class. This wasn't just about an embarrassing moment at a graduation party. This was something bigger, something that had been building for years, something that had gone unnoticed because no one had ever thought to question him. The house was quiet as I made my way down the hall, the air thick with the kind of stillness that only comes when people are trying too hard to pretend they're asleep. Nathan's door was closed, the sliver of light underneath barely visible, the faint sound of movement inside telling me he was still awake. I didn't hesitate before knocking, hard, 3 times, my patience stretched too thin to care about subtlety. There was a long pause before he answered, his voice flat, irritated, already preparing to deflect. "What?" I pushed the door open without waiting for permission, stepping inside and closing it behind me with a quiet click. Nathan was sitting on the edge of his bed, his laptop in front of him, his phone in his hand, his posture stiff in a way that told me he had been expecting this. "Did you even graduate?" I asked, my voice steady, controlled, but carrying just enough weight to make sure he knew I wasn't playing around. Nathan blinked, his fingers tightening around his phone, his jaw clenching just enough for me to notice. "What kind of question is that?" He scoffed, shaking his head, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course I did. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let the silence stretch too far before speaking again. "Then why is there nothing about it anywhere?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, watching as his confidence wavered, as the cracks in his facade widened just enough to let the truth slip through. No pictures, no posts, no announcements, nothing from mom or dad bragging about how their genius son is officially a college graduate. Nathan's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers tapping against the side of his phone, his mind clearly racing to find an excuse, a way out, an explanation that would satisfy me enough to make me drop it. "Maybe I just don't care about posting that stuff," he said finally, shrugging, his tone casual but his hands giving him away. "Not everyone needs to show off their accomplishments like you do." I let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, pretending to consider his words, pretending that I was willing to let them settle. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice light, keeping my expression unreadable. "But then there's this weird thing I found online. An official list of graduates from your school, and guess whose name isn't on it?" The moment the words left my mouth, his entire expression shifted. The irritation disappeared, the forced amusement faded, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in Nathan that I had never seen before: panic. He exhaled sharply, standing up so fast that the bed creaked beneath him, his hands clenched at his sides, his entire body tense. "Stay out of my business, Sam," he said, his voice low, warning, but lacking the usual confidence that made him so insufferable. I stepped closer, refusing to back down, refusing to let him intimidate me the way he had always managed to do before. "I think it stopped being just your business the second Dad stood up in front of everyone and made a fool of himself," I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his, refusing to look away. "So why don't you tell me the truth, Nathan? Did you even qualify to graduate?" For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at me, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. And then, just as I had expected, just as I had already known in the deepest part of my gut, he said nothing at all. Because there was nothing left to say. Nathan stood there, silent and motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin, his entire body radiating tension like a coiled spring ready to snap. I had seen him angry before, had watched him throw tantrums as a kid when things didn't go his way, had listened to him talk himself out of trouble with the smooth confidence of someone who had never once faced real consequences, but this was different. This wasn't just frustration or irritation or even embarrassment. This was fear, the kind that made his hands shake just slightly, the kind that made his breathing uneven, the kind that told me he knew, without a doubt, that the walls were closing in on him and there was no way out. I didn't move from where I stood, didn't blink, didn't let the silence stretch too far before pressing forward, my voice quieter now, steadier, sharper. How long have you been lying? I asked, my words cutting through the thick, suffocating air between us like a blade, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Nathan inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides like he wanted to grab something, punch something, tear something apart just to release the tension that was crawling under his skin. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping just enough to betray how exhausted he really was. "Sam, you don't understand," he finally said, his voice lower, rougher, lacking the usual bravado that had always defined him. "It's not that simple." I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly, watching him carefully, studying the way his gaze flickered toward the door, toward the window, toward anything except my face. "It actually is that simple," I countered, refusing to let him twist the truth, refusing to let him make this into something more complicated than it really was. "You either graduated or you didn't. You either earned that degree or you didn't. So which is it?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling again, shaking his head like he was trying to clear it, like he was trying to figure out how much he could still salvage. "I was supposed to graduate last year," he admitted finally, his voice tight, controlled, forced out through gritted teeth. "But things got messed up." I felt my stomach twist, my pulse quickening, my mind racing to catch up with what he was saying, what he was implying, what he had somehow managed to hide from everyone, even from me, even from my father. The man who had spent his entire life believing Nathan could do no wrong. "Messed up how?" I pressed, crossing my arms, my tone sharp, unyielding, demanding the full truth. Nathan let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it, no arrogance, no confidence, just frustration, just defeat. "I started failing," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping even further. "Not just one class, not just Anderson's class. I failed multiple. I didn't have enough credits to graduate, so I convinced Dad I needed an extra year to refine my career path, and he bought it without question." My breath hitched slightly, my grip on my arms tightening, my entire body tensing as the reality of his words settled into place, as the full weight of his deception became clear. "So, what, you thought you'd just retake a few classes and fix everything?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief, with something sharp and cutting that I didn't even try to hold back. Nathan swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably, his gaze still avoiding mine. "I tried," he muttered, shaking his head. "But it just got worse. The harder I tried to keep up, the more I fell behind. I started skipping classes, missing deadlines, telling myself I'd catch up eventually, except I never did." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I stepped back, as I put more distance between us, as I tried to wrap my mind around the sheer scope of what he had done. "So, you've been lying for 2 years," I said flatly, my voice devoid of emotion, drained of patience, drained of any lingering sympathy I might have had left. 2 whole years of pretending, of making excuses, of letting Dad sing your praises while you stood there, knowing it was all a lie? Nathan flinched, just barely, but it was enough to confirm what I had already known, enough to prove that every single thing I had suspected was true. I turned away from him, my hands shaking slightly, my mind racing, my heart pounding as I tried to process the sheer level of deception, the sheer arrogance it took to pull something like this off. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught something, his laptop, still open on the desk, the screen still glowing faintly in the dim light. Nathan must have noticed the shift in my attention, must have realized too late what I was looking at, because by the time he moved to grab it, I was already there, already tilting the screen toward me, already scanning the open email that sat in his inbox. An email from the university administration, the subject line bold and unmistakable. "Academic misconduct notification. Immediate action required." My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering as my eyes skimmed the contents, as the full weight of what I was reading sank in, as the words burned themselves into my memory. "After a thorough investigation, the university has determined that multiple instances of academic dishonesty have occurred over the course of your enrollment, including, but not limited to, falsified grades, unauthorized alterations of transcripts, and failure to meet the institution's academic integrity standards. As a result, your degree status is under review, and pending final confirmation, your graduation eligibility will be revoked. Any attempts to misrepresent your credentials moving forward will be subject to legal consequences. I felt the blood drain from my face, my fingers tightening around the edges of the laptop, my entire body rigid as the implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. Nathan hadn't just failed, he had cheated. He had forged grades, altered transcripts, done whatever it took to keep up the illusion, to keep Dad's approval, to keep his perfect reputation intact. And now it was all coming apart at the seams. I turned back to him, the laptop still in my hands, my expression unreadable, my voice cold, steady, unforgiving. So I said, letting the words stretch, letting the silence weigh heavy between us. Not only did you fail, but you actually thought you could fake your way through an entire degree. Nathan swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, his breath shaky, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Sam, he started, his voice barely above a whisper, you can't tell Dad. I tilted my head, watching him, studying him, letting the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of my gaze, letting him squirm under the knowledge that, for the first time in his life, he had no control, no way out, no easy escape. And then, slowly, deliberately, I smiled. Because after years of being the afterthought, years of being dismissed, years of standing in his shadow, I had finally found the one thing that could bring his entire world crashing down. The house was filled with voices, with the sound of forks clinking against plates, with the hum of conversation that only happened when my family gathered in one place and pretended, for just a few hours, that everything was perfect. My father sat at the head of the dining table, his posture straight, his presence commanding as always, effortlessly drawing attention without needing to demand it. He was in his element here, surrounded by people who admired him, who respected him, who saw him as the unshakable patriarch of a successful, disciplined family. Nathan sat to his right, shoulders relaxed, mouth pulled into the same easy grin he had always worn at these gatherings, the same carefully crafted expression of confidence and charm, the same performance he had been putting on for years. He laughed at a joke one of my uncles told, clinking his glass against my father's in an effortless display of camaraderie, playing his role with the same flawless precision he always had. But tonight, the script was going to change. I sat quietly, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass, my expression neutral, my heartbeat steady despite the fire burning in my chest. I had waited for this moment, had planned for it, had made sure every piece was in place so that when I made my move, there would be no way for Nathan to twist the truth, no way for my father to brush it aside, no way for either of them to escape the consequences of their own arrogance. So, I said casually, my voice carrying just enough weight to quiet the conversation around me, just enough sharpness to draw their attention without making it obvious that I was leading them somewhere they didn't want to go. Nathan, how's postgrad life treating you? Nathan barely glanced at me, still holding his glass in one hand, his smirk unwavering. Oh, he said easily, shrugging like the question barely required an answer. Same as always. Got a few things in the works, just weighing my options. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider his words, pretending that I wasn't already holding the match that would burn his carefully constructed world to the ground. Interesting, I mused, tilting my head slightly. Because I heard from someone recently that you didn't actually graduate. The room went silent. Nathan's smirk faltered, just slightly, just enough for me to see the moment his mind started racing, calculating, scrambling for a way to recover. My father frowned, his grip on his fork tightening just enough to make the metal press against his knuckles, his gaze shifting between me and Nathan as if trying to determine whether or not this was some kind of joke. What are you talking about, Sam? My father asked, his voice calm but carrying that underlying edge, that quiet warning that had been enough to make me shrink back in the past. But I wasn't a child anymore, and this time, I wasn't backing down. I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapping the screen, scrolling just enough to find what I needed, then setting it down in the center of the table. "Nathan," I said, meeting his eyes, watching as his breathing grew shallow, watching as his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. "Why don't you go ahead and explain this?" The email was open for everyone to see, the university's official letterhead at the top, the bold subject line impossible to ignore. Academic misconduct notification. Immediate action required. I watched the color drain from Nathan's face as my father leaned forward, his brows furrowing, his lips pressing into a thin line as he read the words on the screen, as the weight of them settled onto his shoulders, as the truth he had been too blind to see finally stared him in the face. Nathan let out a short, breathy laugh, shaking his head quickly, reaching for the phone as if he could somehow erase the evidence just by swiping it away. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice too light, too forced, the beginnings of desperation creeping in around the edges. "It's just a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow, my voice sharper now, cutting through the thin veil of control he was trying to maintain. "Nathan, this email literally says they're revoking your degree for academic dishonesty. What exactly is there to misunderstand?" My father's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening as he turned to Nathan, his entire body stiffening with the kind of anger I had never once seen directed at him before. "Tell me she's lying," he said, his voice low, dangerous, filled with the kind of quiet fury that had once been reserved only for me. "Tell me this is some kind of mistake." Nathan swallowed hard, his tongue darting out to wet his lips, his entire body going rigid as he realized, too late, that there was no way out of this. "Dad, answer me," my father snapped, his voice sharp, cutting through the heavy silence, making the entire table flinch. "Did you fake your grades?" Nathan hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough, more than enough. All my father needed to know that everything he had believed, everything he had bragged about, everything he had built Nathan up to be had been nothing but a lie. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of realization, thick with the sound of my father's pride shattering into pieces. "You absolute disappointment," my father muttered, shaking his head, shoving his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. He pushed himself to his feet, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, his gaze locked onto Nathan with something colder than anger, something more cutting than rage. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" Nathan flinched, opening his mouth to protest, to explain, to beg, but my father didn't give him the chance. "You let me stand up in front of everyone and make a fool of myself. You let me believe you were something you weren't. You let me." He exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring, his eyes dark with the kind of disappointment that no amount of apologies would ever be able to erase. "You're not the son I thought you were." Nathan looked like he had been punched in the gut, his hands shaking, his breath uneven, his entire world crumbling in real time. And for the first time in my life, I saw it, the shift, the crack in the foundation, the moment my father finally looked at him and saw what I had seen all along. But I wasn't done yet. Because there was one more truth left to tell, one more nail to hammer into the coffin of his golden boy legacy, one more revelation that would ensure my father never looked at him the same way again. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, tilting my head slightly as I let the weight of the moment settle over the table. "Oh, and by the way," I said, my voice casual, controlled, effortlessly cool, "Nathan didn't just fake his grades, he also stole money from Grandma's inheritance to cover up his tuition debt." The table erupted into chaos. And for the first time in my life, I sat back, sipped my drink, and enjoyed the show. The house was still echoing with the chaos of my last words, the accusations flying across the dining table like sharp, jagged shards of glass, cutting into whatever remained of the golden illusion my father had so carefully built around Nathan. My mother had gone pale, her hands pressed against her temples as if she could physically push away the reality of what had just been revealed. My father stood rigid, his fingers clenched into tight fists at his sides, his breathing shallow and controlled in that terrifying way that always meant he was beyond furious, beyond disappointed, beyond anything he knew how to express. And Nathan just sat there, his shoulders hunched forward, his face slack with the kind of shock that comes only when someone who has never truly suffered consequences finally understands what it means to lose. "You stole from your own grandmother," my father finally said, his voice hollow, empty of all the usual confidence and authority, replaced by something raw and brittle, something that felt dangerously close to humiliation. "You stole from family, Nathan." Nathan shook his head quickly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if steadying himself, his eyes wide and pleading, desperately searching for some way out of the mess he had created, some escape route that no longer existed. "Dad, it's not what it sounds like," he said, his voice cracking just slightly, the forced calm slipping away with every second that passed. "I was going to pay it back, I swear. You just needed to keep lying," I interrupted, leaning back in my chair, tilting my head slightly as I let the weight of my words settle between us, watching as Nathan flinched, as he swallowed hard, as he realized there was no amount of charm or manipulation that could erase the truth this time. "You needed to keep faking everything, because without Dad's blind worship, you're just another guy who couldn't cut it." My father shot me a sharp look, his nostrils flaring, his fingers twitching at his sides, that old instinct to defend Nathan flaring up one last time before reality dragged it back down. But I wasn't finished yet, not even close, because this wasn't just about Nathan's failure. It was about something bigger, something deeper, something that had been building inside me for years, waiting for the right moment to be said. "You spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't good enough," I said, turning my gaze to my father now, watching as his jaw tightened, as his shoulders stiffened, as he realized I wasn't going to let him off the hook. "You told everyone at my own graduation party that Nathan was the real genius in this family, and you didn't even stop to think about whether or not that was true. You just assumed it, because that's what you've always done, assumed that he was better, smarter, more deserving, because you decided a long time ago that he was worth more than me." My mother made a small sound of protest, but I ignored her, my eyes never leaving my father's face, watching every tiny shift in his expression, every flicker of discomfort, every silent moment where he had the chance to argue but didn't. "You never once asked how I was doing in school," I continued, my voice steady, unwavering, pushing forward with every ounce of truth I had kept buried for years. "You never once asked about my grades, never once cared about what I was working toward, never once thought that maybe, just maybe, I was just as smart as him, if not smarter." My father's lips parted slightly, as if to deny it, as if to argue, as if to rewrite history the way he had always done when confronted with something he didn't want to hear. But I didn't give him the chance. "Because I was the one who got a full-ride scholarship," I said, the words slicing through the thick, suffocating air like a blade, watching as my father's breath caught, as his brow furrowed, as the realization struck harder than anything else I could have said. I was the one who graduated with honors. I was the one who didn't need anyone to rig the system for me, who didn't need to cheat my way through, who didn't need to steal from family just to stay afloat. Silence. Heavy, suffocating, deafening silence. Nathan's mouth opened and closed, his fingers twitching slightly, his gaze darting between me and our father, watching, waiting, searching for some kind of reaction that would save him, some last lifeline he could grab onto. But our father just stood there, motionless, his face unreadable, his hands still clenched into tight fists at his sides, his entire body stiff with something I had never seen before, uncertainty. "You never even knew," I continued, my voice quieter now, but no less sharp, no less pointed, no less full of all the things I had wanted to say for years. "Because you never cared enough to ask." Something in my father's face shifted, something deep, something almost imperceptible, something that made his shoulders sag just slightly, as if the weight of everything had finally settled onto his back. Nathan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, his hands running through his hair as he let out a weak, humorless laugh, his last defense mechanism kicking in, the only thing he had left. "Okay, fine," he muttered, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes, his voice hollow, shaking. "So, what now? You in, Sam? Is that what you want?" You finally get to feel superior, is that it? I tilted my head slightly, watching him, considering his words, considering what winning really meant, considering whether or not this was even about that anymore. And then, finally, I smiled. No, I said simply, shaking my head, standing up slowly, feeling lighter than I had in years, feeling the weight of everything I had carried for so long finally slipping away. I don't need to win, Nathan. Because I already have. Nathan blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to argue, as if to demand an explanation, as if to drag me into one last battle, one last attempt to reclaim whatever power he thought he still had. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I turned toward my father, watching as his gaze lifted to meet mine, watching as something unfamiliar flickered behind his eyes, something that looked a lot like respect, something that looked a lot like regret, something that had come too little, too late. But I didn't need it anymore. I had already proven everything I needed to. So, without another word, I walked away, leaving Nathan behind in the ruins of his own lies, leaving my father standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance, leaving behind every single expectation they had ever placed on me, every single shadow they had forced me to live in. Because I was never the second-place child. I was always the smartest person in the room.